So, like, for me, a lot of my framework for how I perceive my place in the world and how I think about the nature of truth and reality is based in the work of Wilfred Bion, the psychoanalyst, where he talks about the difference between faith and belief. And that he talks about faith as, he calls it K, being in K. He uses that the symbol K for knowing. It doesn't mean knowing in the sense of like having data or facts, but knowing as a relationship to truth, as something that, is a relationship with a person you develop in that relationship. Like my wife, I know my wife, but if I ever try to just trap her into the way I understand her today and forget that she's actually a person who develops and grows, that's what he calls belief. Belief is when you stop being in K. You stop being in the process of knowing or the relationship with truth as you experience it and as it unfolds. If I try to say, like, this is who my wife is, I'll cease to be truly to know her. And so he talks about faith being superior to belief because it's being in relationship with truth as it unfolds and as you experience it. And I try to hold that always and understand that, like, my goal is not to be correct in what I think right now, but to constantly uproot and pull at the root of truth and to follow wherever it leads me. And I have to honestly give that a lot of gratitude to my dad and mom, who were Pentecostal pastors, oneness, holiness Pentecostal pastors, but constantly instilled in me this sense of, like, we want you to believe like we believe, but we want you to get there on your own, not because we have it, because it won't be strong otherwise. And I think I landed in a place differently than they expected me to land, but I just had the sense that, like, if I am open to truth constantly and I don't try to dogmatically trap it, right, that I don't have to be afraid of where that takes me and where that leads me. So as far as like what you were talking about is, I think of this article actually last night. David Bentley Hart put out an article that I read that I think gives some language to what you're talking about, that I think is just, he's such a good writer. He's an Eastern Orthodox theologian, philosopher. And he put out this Substack last night called Notes Towards a Polyphonic Politics. And one of the things he says, he's basically talking about how ancient people didn't divide myth and history into like strict categories, right? They had stories about gods, heroes, ancestors, and recent events kind of all living along a single hazy continuum. Not in like a naive sense, but they really operated with a different mode of consciousness that didn't produce ideologies in the way that we do, because they didn't have the kind of competition over what is the one true version of the past. And he talks about modernity shattered that by inventing a history as like an authoritative factual realm that was opposed to myth. And he asserts that, like, when that happened, the struggles over the past essentially crystallized into struggles over identity and political destiny. And then whoever controls that narrative of the past is who controls the future. And I think that collapse of symbolism, right? A lot of times when we talk about the Bible, if you think about it purely from the historical perspective, the way we're trained to, most Christians today are trained to think about it, you end up missing a lot of the historical truth, or of the actual truth that's there. If you look back in church history even, that is not how the church fathers interpreted scripture. People like Gregory of Nyssa, Clement, Origen really kind of was the father of teaching us how to read, what he called reading the scriptures in the school of Christ, understanding that first you have to understand the literal idea. You have like the literal, and that's what a lot of biblical textual criticism deals with. Dan McClellan is an amazing scholar on the internet right now who is doing a lot of textual critical work on the Bible in a public way that's accessible to a lot of people.
Right. Yeah.
But that's only one layer of understanding something, right? Like, it's funny because most Christians possess the tools to read the Bible this way when they apply it only to certain parts, like the parables. Christians aren't quibbling over whether or not the people in the parables were real historical people. It's like somehow the parables surpass this, and we understand to look at, well, what is the spiritual truth that this symbol of this parable is getting at, and we read it that way. But it's hard for us to do that with the rest of the Bible because modernity has conditioned us to understand and try to read and own history in a way that, like Hart talks about,
Yeah.
develops
Well,
ideologies.
it's the Vervaeke talks about, it's propositional tyranny, where it's like, before cognitive I talks about the different ways of knowing. You have propositional, perspectile, procedural, and what happens is all of those different ways of knowing gets kind of shoved into that propositional, where it's not about how we experience or how we relate or the perspectives that we take. It's more about the facts and the beliefs that we hold within that paradigm of like, okay, well, if my facts can beat your facts, then I win. And I don't know if you've read Bion Deloria Jr.'s work. He's a Native American theologian. He wrote a book called God is Red, and he breaks it down better than anybody I've ever heard, because he has a perspective, like he's not just someone that understands the theology behind it, but he's very deep into Jung. He knows psychology, he understands, but he also has a keen insight into like what the indigenous shamanic practices that they had were, or the Native American practices were. And one of the biggest things that he says that I think is that I walked away from that book, was just the difference between the God of time, or a God of place, and a God of time, where it's like, the Native Americans had a God rooted in the place, right? So their worship of that God was embedded into the land around them. And what Christianity did was, instead of holding on to that God that was attached to place, we removed it and put it into the historicity, into time. And so now our gods don't exist in a thing that we actually engage with in a living reality. It's like it's all about what happened or what took place at a specific time, and whether or not we can prove that.
Right.
That creates a lot of problematic issues.
That's good.
But the biggest problem, and I think, we could talk about this a lot, but what I keep running into in these types of conversations, or whenever you try to talk about the symbolic, like even what a symbol is, you try to talk about the need for these different ways of participatory knowing, there's like a wall that gets hit, where there's this it goes up against that framing in which people are like, well, no, like, because we're so trained and we're so conditioned to function within that propositional tyranny. It's like it doesn't allow a lot of space to just so I was thinking about this morning. It's like, we talk about deconstruction, and I've talked about this with other people, that I think that the term and the way that we're viewing deconstruction is a little bit off, because we view it as something that's like this thing that people do because they're hurt, or people do because they've had some kind of trauma, or they've had some kind of issue or whatever. But if you look at cognitive science, and if you look at the way other traditions have worked, it's like that is that is necessary, as far as like breaking up framings, in order to even understand kind of what you're talking about, what I'm talking about, like this whole conversation is that process of being able to get out of that, out of that box, so to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. The book you're talking about, it reminds me of a book from Walter Bruggemann, who's an Old Testament scholar and Christian theologian, passed away this summer, called The Land, Place as Gift, Promise, and Challenge in Biblical Faith. And he kind of talks a little bit about exactly that. Yeah, it's funny you talk about deconstruction, because I made one video about what I think about deconstruction. I don't call it the ire of a lot of people who generally like my content, because I've never even considered myself like deconstructing in the sense that most people mean it. Like you said, coming from a place of hurt, never set out to do a thing called deconstruction. I have always been seeking out to better understand. And most of the shifts that came in my belief system didn't come from me trying to disprove them, but they actually came from me wanting to be able to better prove them. And started when I was really young. We couldn't go to the movie theaters in our denomination. It was unholy to go to a movie theater. So I didn't go to a movie theater until I was almost an adult, like 17. And I remember asking at a youth conference that we had, where they did a breakout section for boys and girls to ask questions. And I just was like, hey, I believe that we shouldn't go to the movie theater. Right? I was like fully indoctrinated. I was like, but I was talking to a friend about it, and I wasn't doing a good job of explaining why. Can you help me explain it better? And like, as they gave me like their best explanations, none of them made any sense. And I was like, no, but there's got to be a better way to explain this. And so almost every change that I had didn't come from me trying to deconstruct something. It came from me trying to better understand it, and then realizing like, well, this doesn't make any sense. What does make sense? Also, I have another petty beef with the way we use deconstruction, which is that I think people think they're using it in like who's the postmodern, not Foucault, but Derrida. Like they think they're doing it in the Derridian sense that like Derrida talked about deconstruction. And that is not what he means by deconstruction at all. Like just deconstructing what you believe. And it's funny because he's actually talking about it in the sense of like language, right? It's a linguistic idea.
Yeah.
And it's funny because even the way they use the term deconstruction is kind of in a meta sense, deconstructing the word deconstruction to make it mean something entirely new.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that to me, I've always just considered it as like my life and like what I believe and think about the world is just a part of my life. And so I'm trying to build out my life. And there are certain times like when you're building out a house, or let's say you live in your home, you might need to remodel a room. There are several rooms in my house of my life that I've had to completely gut because they had lead. I realized the piping was lead and it was dangerous and toxic. I had to rip that old plumbing out and put something new in or do something different. But I've never tried to deconstruct my whole life. There are elements where you have to do some deconstruction, but I'm always kind of viewing it as more so remodeling. To me seems to be a much better analogy for what I'm doing with my life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think depending on who you are, whatever your foundation is built on will determine the level in which you have to kind of go. Because I've talked to certain people that have it's built on, the foundation of everything gets built on a certain axiom or a certain practice or a certain way of looking at the world. And that becomes really challenging because, if you do have to, let's say, change the foundation, well, then, yeah, that does actually create this sense of like the whole house gets changed. And if you have an idea of like, oh, well, actually, I've always had this instilled the ability to question or the ability to look at the way that I'm framing something or the ability to kind of play with ideas. It's like, well, then there might appear to be less of that you have to do. Where I would imagine that there's probably a lot of people that get the rug swept out from under them as far as, just building the intensity of however they structure their life. Maybe a more of a dogmatic approach towards, believing things or accepting things wholeheartedly and not having the tools to know how to question or not having just that natural proclivity to doing that. And so, and I know that can be traumatizing for a lot of people. And I think that is where the security, the psychological security for many people, even without, I think, consciously being aware of it, causes people to retreat into some of those propositions where, even the mentioning of this type of conversation is so threatening. It's so problematic towards that foundation that it will force people to shut down or to not engage. And I think that is a real challenge that we're facing now because it's like, you try to have conversations and, it takes, to have a conversation, it's like the person has to kind of show up authentically. And I think that's a really important part of it. But like learning how to do that, being able to do that, being in an environment, an ecosystem that kind of fosters that or promotes that or encourages that. And a lot of people are not as fortunate, I think, to have that, right? But I mean, you had mentioned that, and I don't want to say that you had it easy because I know, I think you were mentioning it's like we're in situations where you did lose a lot by changing propositions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you lose and you gain. But, for me, and I might just be lucky that, it might just be like a perspective shift because, coming up in a very dogmatic oneness, holiness, Pentecostal upbringing, I think like my perspective on it was that like, if God is truth and I'm seeking after truth, then I'm seeking after God. So as long as I'm seeking after truth, I'm not moving away from the thing itself. And then I have another video where I talked about the last book in the Chronicles of Narnia from C.S. Lewis is called The Last Battle. And, in that, it's kind of like an allegory for Christianity, the whole story. Although he said, interestingly, that it's not an allegory for Christianity. It's a reimagining of what Christianity might look like on another planet that these children get teleported to through a magic portal.
Yeah.
And so, Jesus Aslan represents Jesus, the emperor over the seas, the father, et cetera, et cetera. The people of Narnia are like the church, the chosen people of God. And there are these other kingdoms south of Narnia. There's a kingdom called Calormen. And you see his racism kind of shining through in that he makes the villains brown people with turbans a little bit. And so that's there. But these Calormen, they worship another god named Tash. And Tash is the antithesis of Aslan, right? He's like depicted as like, he's like the sharp beak and razor sharp claws, and the pictures of him, he just looks like this demonic kind of figure, what we would perceive to be demonic. But the people in Kellerman, they worship him. And there's this young Kellerman soldier named Emeth, which is the Hebrew word for truth. And Emeth loves Tash and despises Aslan. He seeks to commit and dedicate his whole life to the service of Tash. And the way that looks for him is he tries to hunger and thirst after righteousness in the name of Tash, to seek after truth, to love mercy and wisdom and justice and righteousness in the name of Tash. And in the end of the book, there's the last battle, and old Narnia is destroyed and new Narnia is there. That's like the New Jerusalem, right? The heaven, essentially. All of the characters, High King Peter and Eustace and Edward and Lucy, and they're going into New Aslan, to New Narnia, and they see this young Kellerman soldier there, and they're like aghast. Wait a minute, what's going on? He can't be here. Like, High King Peter pulls his sword, and there's a little, reference to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and Peter pulling his sword and cutting off the centurion's ear. And Aslan's like, "You put away your sword, Peter," right? Whoever lives by the sword will die by the sword. We don't live by the sword here. And Aslan essentially tells him, and Emeth actually has the same question for Aslan, like, "How am I here?" When Emeth first comes into Narnia, he's scared when he sees Aslan, because he's like, "Oh no, I picked the wrong side." And Aslan essentially says, no. And it kind of echoes some other language in scripture, like, "For now we see through a glass darkly, we know in part, but in the end we will see in fullness, we'll see truth," right? And scripture is all full of ideas about how no one has seen or looked upon the face of God. Even when Moses sees God, he's shown a shadow of God's backside, and that becomes the template for the tabernacle that he builds in the wilderness. He never really is able to see the fullness of God. And so we're always interpreting throughout the story of Israel and the story of Christianity, trying to understand God on this side of eternity in a way that we can't. Aslan says, "You always worshiped me. You just thought I looked like Tash. You thought my name was Tash. But I am not what you call me. I am justice. I am mercy. I am righteousness. I am truth. And so you may have been calling me by the wrong name and had a wrong mental image of who I was, but you saw through a glass darkly," essentially. When I read that, it really solidified for me this idea that if God is truth, if God is goodness and righteousness and justice, as long as I am constantly trying to align my life with those things, I'm never moving away from God. And so I always viewed it as building more. And, the analogy breaks down at a certain point, because, sometimes I did have to completely tear out certain foundations. But one of the foundations, one of the reasons I call myself a Pentecostal to this day, is that heritage that I have. Is that early Pentecostal movement, Trey, was a group of poor, marginalized, disenfranchised people.
Yeah.
Who were uneducated, who had an encounter with reality and interpreted it the best way that they could, tried to be faithful to their experience with reality as they encountered it.
Yeah.
And in doing so, they started to espouse beliefs that the rest of Christendom wrote them off for, that they became heretics for. But they refused to let their experience with truth be boxed in by the dogma around them, and they searched out for that. Then you got, my great-grandfather was a part of the early Pentecostals that left the rest of the Pentecostals and became a oneness Pentecostal, where their understanding of scripture, as they read it, developed to be less and less Trinitarian, more and more what we might call modalism, although it's a little different than modalism. And then beyond that, my great-grandfather then broke off from them, because he was reading the scripture and he's like, wow, my experience of God and my understanding of the scripture, he thought Jesus is the firstborn among creation. He's a created being, right?
Yeah.
Which actually, if you look into the first century of the church, the first couple centuries, Jesus was a kind of a dominant view, was he was more of an angelomorphic creature. He was kind of like the ultimate realization of what the rest of us were to become. So when you look at a lot of those early Christian texts, they talk about God becoming a man so that men can become God. We will become God, or that divinization. As the doctrine developed, we had these councils, and what we've done is interpret these councils as definitive statements that preclude any further development or unfolding of God's revelation. David Bentley Hart, who I referenced earlier, has a great book called Tradition and Apocalypse, where he kind of seeks to redefine tradition, not as a concluded set of beliefs, but he says the people at Chalcedon and at Nicaea, these early councils, really what they did was just kind of try to develop a framework of language to use to help us to continue developing. They're actually quite vague. Like, you can read the Nicene Creed, you could walk away thinking 10 different things. It doesn't have to be that dogmatic approach. So I viewed my Pentecostal heritage and tradition, that foundation, I viewed it not as the set of dogmas and doctrines that were handed to me, but the foundation of pursuing truth, even when it puts me at odds with the dominant dictators of what is the acceptable window. We talk about the politics, you talk about the Overton window of what is and is not acceptable discourse, right? We have that in philosophy as well. We have that in theology as well. And so I just wanted to pull up that root because I thought, well, even if I, like now I say, oh, I don't believe in God, but you know what I do believe in? In justice, truth, mercy, and righteousness. And if the core of what we believe, we say we believe about God is true, is that that's who he is, well, then I haven't really walked away from God. I've walked closer to God. My understanding of what that looks like in terms of being an anthropomorphic being might be different. But yeah, so foundationally for me, I still kind of think about it as I'm in continuity with this story that's always been developing. Christian doctrine has always been developing. I think Fukuyama's idea that we've arrived at the end of history with neoliberal politics, I think that idea pervades all areas and realms of our lives, that we kind of think, well, we've kind of landed at the end of doctrine. So most theological debates now are just about who in the past got it the most right and who am I going to align with in the past, rather than where are we taking this thing from here?
Yeah, you lose the co-creation aspect or the process philosophy, like that has to be a part of it. But yeah, I mean,
there's no imagination. There's no imagination. There's no way to conceive or think.
Yeah, you lose the imaginal. It's funny, you mentioned C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite books. I think I have it up there. I'm not a huge C.S. Lewis fan, just because sometimes I think he gets very, you can see where he's trying to present some type of a narrative in which, or he gets very didactic, I guess. But I don't know if you've read Till We Have Faces, but the part of that book where where she gets to the end and she's written her book about what her life was and the grievances that she's had and all this stuff. And she looks down and the book's different. And the gods, she's face to face with the gods, and they're like, no, tell us the real story. And it's like meeting the gods, like until we are honest with ourselves, until we are able to face what we're actually holding on to. I think about that all the time. In what we're talking about, this pursuit of truth, this pursuit of, and I don't want to say the most authentic self, because that kind of has this decadent romanticism that I try to avoid, because I don't think there's this true authentic self. But I do think in this Corban sense of the divine double or the sacred second self, of like that thing that we aspire to, that is more normative, it's more foundational, it has a sense of appreciation, a truth of goodness that we aspire to, or that we have this anagogic process of like widening, like what I hear you saying. It's like I'm always in this pursuit of widening my framework and widening my lens to better see reality, to have a contact relationality with reality. And I think that starting place is that, that openness of like, well, okay, here's what I know, and here's, or not what I know, but here's who I like, here's how I'm showing up, being honest with yourself, being honest with the process, and allowing yourself to kind of open up into that. And I totally agree. I mean, I think that's what all of these church fathers were doing. It's like they're wrestling, but not all of them. I think some of them had, very clear motives, but the ones that I'm drawn to, the ones that I really appreciate, this pseudo-Dionysus, where they're looking at this apophatic quality of God, and they're looking at this thing of like, well, I don't have, like, it's not that I don't just have the whole picture. It's that none of us are supposed to have the whole picture. None of us are supposed to create those dogmatic formulas in that way, because what it will do is it will collapse into literalism and fundamentalism, and it steals, it takes from us that imaginative, creative quality, that ability to evolve with and participate with the divine and the sacred and the ground of being. Because at the end of the day, what you're saying and what I'm hearing, and I think what a lot of people do, is that no one's really trying trying to think how to say this. Any notion of God at best, and going back to Tash, it's like at best, it's not that they got it wrong and then God corrected them. It's like none of them were right. None of them would have been right. None of them were ever going to be right. That's the problem with sectarianism. It's like, because what you're worshiping is not God. You're worshiping a model that we have created.
That's right.
And I think that's it's hard, because once you start talking about this, it gets into such heretical spaces with so many people. I think because we don't understand the way that people were having these conversations, the way that Origen, the way that, and then also even just the Platonic influence on the church fathers and what they were talking about and how they were essentially influencing a lot of the grammar that we have today and a lot of the grammar of the church fathers. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I do feel like there are, I do feel like there is an advent of the sacred that's coming, where people are having these conversations, where things are starting to open up, where we're starting to get back into this relational ontology with, I love Tillich. I love his work, and the idea of the courage to be, I think, is this one of the.
That book might have saved my life.
I've read it once. I'm reading it again right now, and I'm realizing how much I didn't understand the first time. It's not that I didn't understand. It's like, I think I could read it every year and probably be like, wow. Yeah. Wow. Like, you start to feel it, like it starts to kind of like permeate in your bones, and you're like, wow, this is really powerful. And so I think for me, I don't know how you feel, but I think this is where I always land, especially when I get into any type of church history or these social discourses or these evangelical spaces. I'll have people that will comment like, oh, this is not God, or this is like heretical or whatever. Most of the time, Protestant evangelical Baptists that haven't read anything that was written in the last, the oldest book they've read is written in 2005 or something. It's like, it's really hard to have these conversations, because I feel like it almost requires such a robust framing of like, and this is, I think, the appropriate term of the deconstruction of like pulling back some of those propositions that you hold on to so tightly that have been handed to you from a cultural grammar.
Yes.
As opposed to really understanding like, and it's not so much about, and I always say this, it's not so much about me like proving an alternative proposition to you. I think the fact that there was a conversation at the beginning says all that it needs to. Like, fact that there's a conversation should make a person, any rational person, look back and kind of step back and say, there actually was a conversation in which,
yes,
exactly what you're saying, at the Council of Nicaea. It's like, these weren't just men, like they were wrestling with this topic.
Yeah. Yes, very much so. And I think there's like a cynicism where people often, there's like a far oversimplification that people usually do on Instagram Reels and TikToks, where it's like, well, Constantine came in and basically decided what was going to be Christian doctrine.
Yes. Oh my God. Yes.
He put a lot of pressure in that he wanted them to come to conclusions.
He just wanted it to stop. He was like, you guys the noise is too much. I've got things to do. Let's just figure it out and move forward.
Yeah. And he honestly, I mean, like Athanasius, he kind of won out that idea, that Christological debate with the Arians, but with Arius. But I mean, he was like multiple times during the Council of Nicaea, he was excommunicated, or what do you call it when you get like banished by the empire? Yeah, and then ended up still winning out for a large part. Like at that point, the dominant understanding of Christology was closer to Arianism, closer to viewing God as an angelomorphic creature who was, the firstborn among creation. And so you're right, like they were very much trying to figure this out. And then they didn't. Like it took many more councils to even get to the language that they have for understanding God now.
And politicking. Eusebius, I think, you look at Eusebius' relationship with Constantine, and you're like, he was pulling some strings there. Like he was like using influence, and he was really like, it's like you could say, oh, divine this, and like, yeah, but okay, so now where does that fall into? It's like, is that
especially with the later generations, like his son Constantius, right? Like Eusebius executed like a lot of influence on the development from there. And yes, 100%. And like what you were saying earlier, it comes back to like what I'm talking about from Bion, right? Once you say, I believe, belief collapses K, and you now create an idol. You're no longer worshiping God. You are now worshiping the conception that you settled on for who God is and what reality is like.
Yeah.
You are now in the realm of idolatry. Whereas if I'm instead trying to be in relationship with God, that is a constant unfolding thing. Once I say, no, my wife is who I know her to be today, and I refuse to continue to know her as I experience her and encounter her, then I fall out of that relationship. I cease to know her, and I now think of her only as the idol I've created or the belief that I've
It's the having,
encapsulated her.
the having mode
That
versus being
possessing.
mode. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And that development of Christian idea, you talk about pseudo Dionysius, like that to me is the theology that I'm most interested in comes from that line, that kind of very Neoplatonically influenced pseudo Dionysius, the Cappadocian fathers, into Tillich, into Moltmann today. Jurgen Moltmann, the Lutheran German theologian, he threw down his guns. He ran to the British and basically threw down his guns in World War I, I think it was, and became a prisoner of war.
Yeah.
For the Brits. He writes about understanding Jesus as what he calls prolepsis, which is like a way to see the end now. So think about, like, he talks about essentially seeing God as Jesus as a time traveler, that Jesus is our destiny, where we are all headed. And the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, that future unfolding, is where we're all moving towards. And I think, like you said, it gets into territory where people start to be offended or be scared because you're now challenging the idols that they've set up. But I think that they should really take seriously. I think it's Matthew 25, right? I think, where Jesus talks about separating the sheep from the goats. And he says, there's going to be many who come to me and say, Lord, Lord, did we not cast out demons in your name and prophesy in your name? And he's going to say, look, I've never known you, right? Like, just like the young Kellerman soldier, Emeth, Aslan says, you were worshiping me all along and you thought I was Tash. There are people like, I think it's Susan that gets into Narnia. She doesn't get into New Narnia, even though she worshipped Aslan, because she was really worshiping the figure of Tash looking like Aslan. And so I think as soon as we try to collapse the ultimate reality that we really can't understand or conceive of in its fullness or in its entirety, into a set of dogmatic principles, you cease to know God. You cease to be in relationship with God. I think they should be very nervous about the ways in which they're using the name Jesus, right, but worshiping idols of their own making, or of the making of doctrine makers from centuries past.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, there's so many different ways, like there's so much there, because I've kind of retreat in a lot of those conversations where, I mean, I don't get into them a ton, but again, I go back to this thing of like, well, if I'm going to have a conversation with someone about these topics, and yet they don't, like I said, they don't know the ramifications behind like what was actually happening, what happened during that Reformation, and all that's like kind of wrapped up into that, it gets really hard, because you're almost like there's not really a lot of talking ground there, where it's like, okay, I'm going to bring up a point, because it's not going to be what I'm trying to say. It's going to be what's heard. Right. And so like what you were saying, there is a, and if you look at it psychologically, it's like, well, that is a psychological defense. It's like, well, this is what provides that safety and that security and that sense of meaning. And if you start to have a conversation that treads into anywhere where it looks like it might challenge or provoke or create these egoic belief systems, or challenge these egoic belief systems, it's not really a fruitful conversation. And so that's why I try to avoid the discourse of like, debate or argumentation, because it's like, to me, it's just, it doesn't feel fruitful, because it's like at a certain point, it's like I'm more interested. It's like, well, this person's salience network, what are they finding like salient? And as they're talking, you can see like, oh, there's an algorithmic play that's happening, where most people, if they say something to you, I mean, all of us really, you can probably trace that back. Like I could trace back, oh, the seed of what you're saying goes from this thinker to that thinker to this thought, and that's, where that goes down to. But without the capacity of being able to like know and kind of trace those seeds, the germination of where that started, it lives in the psyche as an original thought or truth, or discerning the word of God, or hearing, and you hear that a lot where it's like people are like, oh, I'm just discerning what's truth. I had a video the other day where I posted something about, I think it was like truth is transformation, and getting out of this idea of this thing that we have, but it's like this ongoing thing. And somebody commented, truth is truth, and I was like, what? Like a plant is a plant? Like what is that? Like
Yeah,
what does that
that's
mean?
called a thought terminating cliche.
Right, and it's like, so I think a lot of yeah, a lot of this, it's like, and I'm constantly thinking of this, of like just becoming better and more articulate to be able to, in real time, be more aware of the network in which a person, like the framing of a person with where they're at psychologically, mentally, emotionally, and what that capacity is to like have these conversations.
So I have a couple of thoughts there. Like, one, I try to remind myself that my content that I put online is for the people it's for, and it's not for the people who it's not for. It will resonate with some and it won't resonate with others. And what I'm trying to do is I do have like solutions or ends that I want to prescribe often, and sometimes I do. But largely, I really want my videos to help people expand their consciousness, which is why, like, when I say that my target audience are either progressive Christians, progressive evangelicals, or progressive ex Christians, is these are people who are already, in my opinion, like on the path to like thinking, and they need better tools and resources than what the majority of the popular voices that cater to those audience are. You clip it or whatever, but like, you know, you got to make a living. But like at a certain point, you're selling so many things that I start to become skeptical of how, like, are you just here to do what cable news does and create outrage and foster a community of people who operate in a different set of thought terminating
Yeah,
cliches so that you can
very,
develop an
very
audience and sell
polemical.
them more stuff? Yeah,
Yeah.
like, and there's a lot of the popular deconstruction influencers out there, in my opinion, are water. And I can't speak to the veracity or authenticity of what they think or believe. I tend to just take people at their face value. But so I'm trying to, I want to help expand people's consciousness. And so that's my audience, because I think, well, that's who my content is going to help expand more. There's a lot of people pulling them out more broadly into a deconstruction space. And then where can I point that? How can I aim that or help to sharpen or provide better tools or resources to think about it more nuanced and less tribal, because it becomes like a kind of new tribal dogma, right?
Yeah, oh,
There's a
I
lot
mean,
of people.
100%. I mean, but that is so, and that's why I was going back to this thing of like, at the end of the day, propositional tyranny is not just something that
Mm,
it's not just a thing that's in your brain. It's a framing within a cultural, within a modernal space, within a capitalistic structure, within the entire value system of what we have. And the reality of it is like, it's not even necessarily just about getting someone to get out of that. It's like looking at the entire ecosystem, because at the end of the day, spiritual practice is not about what you believe or like if you do a certain things. It is an ecology of practices. And ecology is not just, that's one part of it, is like how we're orienting ourselves towards thought, but the other thing is like how we are embedded into the society around us. And I find that a
yes.
lot of times, even when we're on this pursuit of an upward spiral towards becoming more in contact with the good, the true, and the beautiful, society itself is going to have, you're swimming upstream and you're going against the current. Like we were handed individualism. Like we were put
Hmm.
into this Cartesian Lutheran mindset. It's not that we woke up and chose it. So at the end of the day, I think that temptation of what you're talking about is always going to be is always going to be. I mean, I think that is what my work is interested in, because it's like, okay, well, we need a reframing. We
Yes.
need the advent of the sacred, which, and I think this is where I think we can get, and I'm actually really interested in this because I know you are a little more political. I tend to sit back and I'm like the police, it's like there is no political solution to our troubled evolution, that line. And I see the necessity for it. But I'm also curious as to like what that framing without the symbolic and the imaginal, at what point are well, I guess another way to put it would be like this. I think Dan McClellan would be a good example. I think he's doing a tremendous service, and I think he's doing what he does really well. And I think that's all any of us need to do is what our knowledge and expertise is to do that, to the best of our ability. But I'm also I always ask, for the people that are coming out of that, and maybe this overlaps with the people that you're interested in communicating to. When you receive that information and it breaks up maybe some ideologies or things that you've held on to, and you're like, okay, this is interesting. I'm going to move into the next space, whatever that is. Like, I don't know what I know, Dan's practicing Mormon, but I think he's really close chest with that. He doesn't really express why he still does that. He doesn't really
Yes.
talk about, which I'm assuming from my perspective, the imaginal, symbolic, participatory. There's all of these components in which he's fully aware of or participating in. But I think a lot of people that maybe consume that and I met them, kind of sit with this place of like, okay, so the Bible is not what I was taught it to be. It's something else. Okay, now what? And I think a lot of people live in that space. And I think like you can look throughout history and people like Marx and Hegel and like all these guys, like they offer these pseudo-religious approaches towards what that would look like as far as either rebellion or revolt or just some type of like action. But yeah, I'm just curious to get into it as to like, well, what is, yeah, like as we tease that out and we look at that, I'm in the impression it's like, I think it has to be even bigger. I think it has to be like not a new religion, but it definitely has to have that magnitude of something that has the capacity to hold a greater sense of meaning. And I know that you, like I said, you've commented a lot of stuff. So I'm curious to get your insights on that. I do feel like you're someone that kind of has a robust understanding of a lot of this. And so I'd be curious to see like how you frame your actions and how you frame like the
Yes.
approach and where it comes from. Does that all make sense? What I was asking?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm trying to think of the best place to start responding to that is, yeah, I'm very political. And so, earlier I talked about like my target audience and how I want to expand consciousness, but like ultimate, like another goal of mine is kind of to move liberal, progressive, evangelicals, or Christians, ex-evangelicals, and post-Christians to move them from liberalism to a Marxist framework. Like I want to be very honest that like you know, I want to move them to what we might broadly call a further left down the spectrum. But the way that I try to go about doing that is understanding like what I know about, what I know a lot about is Christian theology, and what I have a deep respect for is the Christian mythos and theological perspective. I think that if anything, if we want to have a future as humanity, I don't know that we need new religions, although I'd welcome them. But I think that we need to have the future, I think, has to look like a generous syncretism, like a generous cosmopolitanism that rejoices in the festive unity of boundless difference. And I think that a lot of religious traditions are, I think, pulling at a similar thread. There's, if you get to the heart of like Christian mysticism, it looks pretty similar to a lot of Mahayana Buddhism or Sufic Islam or Vedic, Hinduism. One, I often say that I'm interested in Vedantic Christianity. They seem to be getting at some similar things. And even, Mahayana Buddhism, they have this idea of rainbow bodies. David Bentley Hart, I keep referencing him. He's kind of like my goat. He's got this idea that he's worked out talking about the resurrection of Jesus's body as a Buddhist rainbow body, in that Jesus might be the first Buddhist rainbow body, which once these monks reach a certain level of enlightenment, their body kind of dissolved into fractals of light and they ascended into, a different reality. Christian theologians like the ones we've been talking about will often talk about the resurrection of Jesus. And when I talk about Jurgen Moltmann saying Jesus is prolepsis, like a time traveler from the future, showing us what our ultimate reality will be, is, I think, moves us towards, I think humanity in a Hegelian sense is moving in a dialectical framework towards some kind of future, and you might call it an end or you might call it a future. But the way I look at Jesus is he represents what humanity is moving towards. And that's I think requires a politic that is anti-authoritarian, that is radically egalitarian, that is cosmopolitan in nature. And so, like, I want to not convince people, like, I'm an atheist. I don't want to convince people to be atheists. I want to help Christians expand their understanding of their faith in a way that is less fascist, in a way that is less authoritarian or less nationalist. And I think that Christian theology is ripe for that. I don't think I can have that done in every way. The other thing I want to say here is I spent the last 13 years basically being a sales trainer. So I'm a financial advisor, but I don't really meet with a lot of clients on my own anymore. I mostly train my team and other people how to do that. And when we talk about, like, how do we have these conversations with people that it scares them to even begin to look at things that are different than how they perceive it and how they believe it. When I'm doing sales training, I always tell people, look, facts tell and stories sell. Almost no one is persuaded to buy anything on the strength of the logic, on the conviction of your logic, but almost always based on the emotional aspect of it. Like, everybody buys, in my opinion, based on emotion and not based on logic. You buy based on emotion and then you justify based on logic. Like, even the most engineer-brained, technical type person, they'll go out and buy the new computer. They know they don't need the new computer. They could just keep it, but they'll justify it with all the facts about the specs of the new computer, why it's better, right? But I think that they bought it emotionally, personally. So when I'm talking to other people, I think that if I want to be effective in that political avenue, I think the way the communicator or the person trying to get the idea across views the people that are listening to them, even the ones that don't agree, determines everything about the trajectory of where it's going to go, more so than the logic of what they're saying. So, like, I'll give you an example. I have people that come into my comments, and if they're just like, if they won't talk to you in good faith, I'll just block those people. I had to block this guy. You can bleep out his name if you want, named Nathan Finocchio, who was kind of like a theologian at Hillsong, and then he started his own online thing called TheosU. He was coming into my comments and just calling me a snake and, like, just saying, like, rude things. And I'm like, well, like, here's another video where I talk a little bit more about X, Y, and Z. You're right. Like, I could have elaborated more on that in this video, and I failed to do so. So I made this other video. Watch that. Tell me what you think. And he wouldn't respond, right?
Yeah.
He just calling me names. So I just blocked that guy. A lot of people, though, they'll come in hot, but they actually want to have a conversation about it. And I found that some of the people who were, like, the rudest and meanest to me, like, I have one guy in particular, he would comment on every video about why I was wrong, blah, blah, blah. And I would just respond with kindness, because the way I view him is he's not my enemy just because he has a different idea than me.
Yeah.
He's just like me. He's just somebody trying to understand the world. And so I would treat him with a lot of kindness and respond like, hey, I don't have time to respond to this right now. I'll try to get back to it later, but I really appreciate you thoughtfully engaging with me. Just stuff like that. Next thing you know, this guy's commenting on my videos being like, oh, bro, this is so good. This is great. I love this. You're really making me think. And I haven't even argued with him. I just keep presenting the information. But people, you know, if there's nothing in sales training I'll tell my people is nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And so I think, like, if you can't be vulnerable, you told me early on that you sensed a kind of vulnerability in some of my videos. I mean, there's probably not a better compliment you could pay me. And it's not even a compliment, it's just like an observation, but I want nothing more than to be vulnerable. And, like, if what I'm saying is wrong, I want to change it. And so sometimes I've had people make comments on my videos or stitch me. They don't do this so much on Instagram, but on TikTok, they like to stitch your video and then, like, do a takedown video of you. There's been a couple of times where I thought, wow, that's a really important point that they made. I think I was not, like, quite viewing this right. And you can reply to a comment or reply to a stitch. I'll make a comment reply and do a reply correcting myself and talking about why this person was right.
Yeah.
And that's not because I'm trying to create some narrative about who I am, but, like, genuinely, I just want to understand better. I'm a seeker. Like, we're all on this journey together. So I think, like, how do we talk to people who, like, disagree with us like in very serious ways, well, I'm just going to continue to be in a relationship with them. Like my mom and dad couldn't disagree with me more. People often will ask, if your dad's a Pentecostal pastor, what's your relationship with him like? And I recognize I want to be sensitive that some people, they can't do what I'm about to say that I've done because it's genuinely too harmful for them. Maybe they're queer, and being in spaces with those people that are constantly challenging their own humanity, that's like a different thing. That's like a personal attack, not an attack on what they believe even. You know what I mean? But for me, like my relationship with my dad is just as good as it's always been, even if we disagree on everything. Because it's not rooted in how much we agree or disagree with each other. It's rooted in relationship. And I think I understood this for the first time when I had a friend named Morgan who had this other friend who I thought was a complete D-bag. Like I was like, this guy's such a jerk. He's mean and he's rude, and he'd been mean and rude to me. And I asked Morgan, I'm like, your guys' values are completely antithetical. How can you be friends with him? And Morgan said, man, I think it's just like shared experience. How interesting is that? Like shared experience happens to be the thing that unites people and binds people together. So yeah, I think that there's like a deeper element and a spiritual element to how we treat and how we understand people informs how we treat people.
Yeah.
Thoughts become beliefs, become actions, become results. So I'm not interested in attaining all of the results. I fully recognize that like my political aims might not be realized, if ever, for 100, 200 years from now. And so I'm detached from the outcome, and I'm trying to attach myself only to what can I do now and how can I live. There was this debate or interview between Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ezra Klein that kind of went viral not that long ago. And one of the things that Ta-Nehisi said in there was, he basically was like, look, like we might never see the world that we want to live in. And there's going to be a lot of pain and a lot of hurt. And Ezra Klein was like, well, I think that's really defeatist and negative. Like I try to view things through more of an optimist range. And Ta-Nehisi's like, well, yeah, it's because your ancestors weren't slaves. You don't understand like the amount of people that had to turmoil and had to work to get to the point of abolishing slavery in the United States. You know what I mean? Who never got to see the fruits of their labor. So I try to think about, what am I thinking about? And this is another thing that most people I think don't engage in, that I learned in sales actually, is one of my great sales trainers would always say that you have to think about what you're thinking about. You have to analyze and interrogate your own assumptions and your own thoughts. Because if you don't, if you don't know where you're going, any path will do. And you can just settle in a place that doesn't matter. So to me, like I'm oriented in a direction. I know like where I want to go. I don't know what it looks like to get there entirely, but I can control what I think about, which determines, I think, my beliefs, which determines how I act in the world and treat other people, which I think eventually will determine the results. So I think, bell hooks, and I've been rambling, but bell hooks talks a lot about how the left has abandoned love as a political project, and how if the left wants to be effective in the world at all, it has to retake back up love as a political project. And it goes back to the Bible again, right? Like if you speak in the tongues of men and angels and you do all these great works, but you don't have love, you're as but a resounding gong. So like, yeah, my goal on here is to raise consciousness, to treat people respectfully, and to try to live in the world now as I hope it will be someday.
Yeah. No, I mean, I just wrote on this as well in regards to the left. I would say the sacred as a whole, just the sense of meaning, the sense of awe, the sense of wonder, the sense of something beyond these technocratic solutions, or these ideas that we're gonna we'll find we'll way out through some type of materialistic endeavor or some type of like policy. And I mean, that's hard in and of itself when you're so entrenched and entwined in the system itself, trying to think your way out. It's like thinking your way out of a box. It's like you don't actually do that. Like it actually doesn't work. Like you have to set up the conditions in which that can be reframed. And so when I think about all this stuff, it always makes me think, it's like, okay, a reframing, reorientation, has to happen in a lot of powerful ways that I think require empathy, communication, authenticity, narrative, all of these things you're talking about, working with people, like listening to people. and really trying to, like I say, going back to the church history stuff, my biggest thing in these conversations is always like, I don't need to argue a point. I think just the fact that there's multiple points is the thing that needs to be acknowledged by both sides. And
Yes.
that is something that, I think is really necessary for everybody to come to the table and say, okay, we don't know. There's all sorts of challenges that are going to come, and this is where I look at like that connection to the discourse, and how much to participate in the political side, because it's not because I don't think it's necessary, but it's because I think that my for me personally, my hesitation has always been around like we were talking about earlier, the challenge of literalizing and flattening certain into pseudo religious ideologies, because it's like when you're in such a vulnerable state, like where society is at right now, like modernity is in such a restructuring, right, that the capacity of what is needed to hold that framing is something that is beyond me, right? It's beyond my idea. It's beyond what I can come up with.
Yes.
And the challenge is, if I give people an answer as opposed to the symbol, it will literalize and flatten into some type of ideology that will be projected onto with that same religious zeal, that same energy of, I've got the mindset of liberation, right? Like I've got the
Hmm.
mindset of, if I can do these certain things, I will create this world and this will happen. And that can equally become dogmatic and fundamentalist in those capacities. So it's almost like trying to figure out that balance of like, where am I, like what has the capacity to hold that without projecting or without like bringing on, because I was thinking about, even with Mark and like Gramsci, right? Like, I see a lot of the stuff being posted now, and it's like, I actually don't disagree with anything that they say. Like, I think a lot of that stuff is actually really true. I think it also requires a sense of modal confusion from a society for those things to be present. So it's like there's a framing that has to be present already before anybody will participate, before any of those stuff is even possible. And so, like, an example that I would think of would be like, there's always this Gnostic urge to create this demiurge of like a person, a community group, some type of enemy or other, the rich, the powerful, like whatever it is, and put them in a category of Gnosticism or a Gnostic view of like, um, there's a force behind this that is causing, which I mean, I actually think that like there are certain things that you see play out where it's like, yeah, 100%, like, um this is happening, but I think it's more of an exploitation of the modal confusion that's already existing towards the having mode, where it's like people are like, oh, I got to have more. So you create a system in which people benefit from it, in which they're like, well, their natural proclivity is going to be towards, if I can have it, why not? Like, why not just take as much as I can? And I can justify it. Cause like I would argue that the majority of people that I've met, cause I come from the business world as well. And it's like, I've met a lot of millionaires that, that they're never going to look at themselves as being a bad person. They're never going to look at themselves as being like, so it's like, so it just caused me to kind of step back a little bit and look at this and say like, man, like what, like holding everybody with this light, but also holding this idea that there's also truth of the fact that these are marginalizing or exploitative practices. These are, not just towards other humans, but also towards environmental, like we have all those, climatological issues and all that. And so it's like, yeah, I mean, like, I don't know. I just think of it as like, I look at this as there's so much that I don't know, that I'm unsure of, but I'm also
Yeah.
like,
Same.
there's a need for a discourse. And there's also a need. And that's why I was actually excited to have this conversation, because I'm like, I see someone that's actually thoughtful, well read, engaged, has a similar background. And so it just makes me excited to have this conversation, because I think that like at the end of the day, you know, that mutual that dialogos of sharing and kind of, moving in lockstep with someone else and seeing the way they're seeing it and kind of going back and forth is very helpful.
Yeah, I agree. And I think like if you continue to be in a relationship of knowing with the pursuit of truth as it unfolds and you experience it, you know, you will learn things that you go, oh, you realize like, oh, somebody's thought of this already. And they've helped me understand. One of the things I love from Marx is, that I think a lot of like internet leftists don't get today is they view the capitalist as the enemy. And Marx is like very clear in some areas where he's like, the capitalist is not the enemy. It's the system of capital that distorts that. And there's a lot of building and dialectical development on top of Marxism that's happened throughout the years, a lot of theory that shows us that, it's not, it's, if we, the goal that I want is liberation, right? So like, maybe that looks like Marxist Leninism. I think that's like a compelling vision. Like I think what China is doing is actually pretty compelling, but maybe it doesn't. If even Marx starts with consciousness, right? Like Marx says that if you do go the route of revolution, revolution cannot happen until the masses gain class consciousness. Their consciousness has to change. It's still operating in a realm like, as much as Marxists want to say, and I do agree that the superstructure or the base structure is what informs the superstructure, not the other way around. That if we don't have a class consciousness, you can't really develop the kind of politics. So, but if we can develop our consciousness towards viewing every other person as somebody worthy of dignity and somebody worthy of, a future and wholeness and life, then I think that will inevitably move us into a different kind of politics. And this is one of the things in Christian theology that I find so compelling is if this idea that we were created in the image of God, meaning that we are bearers of the divine image, that we are being in the Eastern Orthodox idea of theosis, we are being brought up into God's own life, then if you really believe that, you really can't look at anybody and view them, as less human. And so for me, just when the rubber meets the road, like I'm anti-capitalist, not just because of the ideology, I think it works badly, but I realize, look, like if I used to be a liberal and I just came to the point where I realized, hey, what is the end play? If it plays out the way liberals want it to play out, what will happen is we will have a very egalitarian society here in the United States in the imperial core. We'll have a lot more freedoms. People will have a lot more financial security and stability. But based on the analysis that I understand and what I see is that cannot live on its own unless it's sustained by a system of global oppression, of resource theft, of domination of people in the not underdeveloped world, but the de-developed world. Like there are areas that were more developed and now because of capitalism are less developed. So the US will have no option but to set up client states like the UAE so that they can go in and fund armies in the Sudan that destabilize the regions in the Congo so that we can mine the coltan. Like we know that all of our devices are operating on these minerals where there are literal slaves who are being forced to stand in for hours a day, 12 plus hours a day in standing water, barefoot, mining these minerals. And if they stop working, it's enforced with SA or beating or death. And so when I look at it, I go, okay, like, well, then that means we have to move towards a politics that operates differently. But another thing that I think people get wrong with Marx a lot is they think that Marxism is capitalism bad, communism good. But Marx saw capitalism as a necessary epoch in the development of human civilization, right? That like in order to move out of an agrarian society into a feudal society, that in order to industrialize, capitalism is necessary. This is why a lot of people look at China and they go, well, they're not really communist. They have billionaires and they have capitalist structure. That's because in the 80s, they instituted what we call the Deng reforms that brought capitalism more to China. But what they're doing right is they're essentially, in my opinion, speed running capitalism. They put out, they have their 2050 plan to be a full communist state by 2050. Every 5 years, they put out another 15-year plan where they adjust and change things to look at what that looks like. And they have dramatically raised the quality of life for the average Chinese person in such a short span of time, so much faster than American capitalism did from our more agrarian kind of society to an industrial society. And now, as China develops, they have less billionaires. They're nationalizing more and more industries. And they recognize, though, just like a system of global capital can't operate on its own because you have to have trade relationships and partnerships in an industrial society, they're going about it much differently. Instead of setting up imperial outposts across the world so that the capitalists can come in and steal the resources, they're going into Africa and going, hey, we want to give this country $10 billion or whatever the number is, $50 billion to invest in your local infrastructure so that you can be a better trading partner. And then we'd love to enter into favorable trade negotiations with you, right? As an autonomous nation operating on your own that we don't dominate or control. I think it's like just a very different outlook on things. So, but you're right. Like, I can't know what ultimately is going to be better, but what I can control is trying to help move people's consciousness towards one that views all of humanity as an international, as a brotherhood. There's a lot of people like to bash Paul on the internet right now. Like, there's like a big, like, Paul is very different than Jesus, and it's just very naive and like not rooted in any real historical scholarship. Somebody, I made a video about that, and there's somebody commented who I really respect and like, they're like, well, they're like, I think you're right here, but don't you think that, like, if we get rid of Paul, that might help us get rid of nationalism? If you get rid of Paul, I don't see how Christianity ever escapes nationalism, because Paul is the one who's like, look, Israel was the only nation that was ever the chosen nation. And through Jesus, that nation has been expanded to all people, which essentially then precludes ever the possibility of there being a preferred nationality, a preferred race, a preferred ethnic group. We're all part of that kingdom, that burgeoning kingdom.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny you mentioned that. There's a guy that I've listened to before where he was talking to somebody. He's like, sometimes I daydream of, like, what if Paul just wouldn't have got up from the road, like on Damascus, like if he would have just been knocked out and just gotten lost and never returned or whatever. And I was like, yeah, it's such a, this guy, he's got a lot of anti-Christian rhetoric, which is like, I understand where he's coming from, but it's like, I think
Yeah,
he's
I get it.
maybe a little stuck. But anyway, it's funny because I look at this and it's like, I think it's really easy to try to go back and to try to like bash and look at certain things and say like, oh, this and that. It's like, but at the end of the day, it's like the reality of things that that have coalesced together have, so then it's like, okay, well, that doesn't really help us much. It doesn't really like, offer any type of practical relationality to where we're at right now. I tend to be in the school of thought of like looking at these archetypes or these forms that have kind of floated throughout or like that have gained steam. You mentioned China and India, and I think about like the Enlightenment, because it's like, yeah, we could talk America, but it's not America. This is Enlightenment. Like this whole model, this industrialist notion, all of this came as like as a form or an archetype that started in Britain and moved into where we're at now. And so we're more or less just participating with that lineage of what's been handed to us. But again, I go back to this idea of like, okay, well, what were the things what were the like kept other countries out of that, or that, like, I mean, India, for example, it's like, I think, you look at where they're at right now and it's like, yeah, they've had their own issues, but I mean, they're growing in a lot of ways that I think, and largely it's like they've been able to avoid a lot of this. I mean, there's influence, don't get me wrong. Of course, Western influence is like sometimes a disease that just gets everywhere and whatnot. But I think the traditions of a lot of these, the religio, or these binding forces to other forms, and like what you were saying made me think when you were talking about exporting some of the the things that we don't want to look at, or the realities that we don't want to face. It's like, I think of that too, even psychologically. And a lot of people will suppress a lot of the stuff that we don't want to think about, and put it in a category, put it in a place where it's like, okay, well, if I can put it here, I don't have to think about it, I don't have to deal with it. But similarly, those things never go away. They leak out, and they will influence and they will impact in other ways. They will be projected instead of like actively engaged with this. So I look at the indigenous shamanic routes of like some of the practices that they had. It's like they understood that you deal with things as they come up, and you address them as they happen, instead of whitewashing or creating this illusion in which we're like, oh, everything's good, everything's this, like if we can, up and to the right, like as long as it's everything good, we don't have to think about all the other stuff. We don't have to ritualize that out. We don't have to, you know deal with it. And I think that neglect of the shadow, to me, is one of the biggest issues that we're facing, because you see this playing out within Christianity, within psychology, within capital. Like, there is a rejection of of the shadow of the parts that you're talking about, and they get pushed into other places. Now, here's the thing I want to ask you, because this is something that I've dealt with in the past, and it's like, I think it's an issue that a lot of people that are listening might deal with. And I mean, I've talked to people personally, a lot of people I've worked with, as clients. What we're talking about is big energy. I mean, this is big stuff. This is overwhelming stuff. Like, holding the capacity of these things that are taking place in the world, the challenges, the uncertainty, these archetypal forms, without a ritualized, symbolic way of moving that energy, or living in a way where it's like, it doesn't, I think about Nietzsche, and I think about somebody that was hitting on to a lot of truth. I love the quote. I don't know if it was Tillich or somebody was talking about Nietzsche. Nietzsche stared into the abyss that they're all talking about. The only problem is he didn't look long enough. He didn't keep looking long enough. And you see where that energy really possessed. I love Jung's letter commentary on Zarathustra. And you see what happens when we don't have the community or the ecology of practices around us to be able to enter into, engage with these topics, these ideas, these forms, this heavy energy, without falling into nihilism or falling into despair or some of those things. And so I'm curious as to what, I guess you're holding on to this Pentecostal background, or Pentecostals know how to, they have ritual, man. They know how to do, like, they're way more than the Baptists. So maybe that's, I don't know. I don't want to speak for you, but I'm curious, because it's like, I hear you talk about heavy topics with a very, like, upbeat, not that you're happy about it, but you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't seem to be like you're, doesn't seem.
Yeah. Well, I think, I'll go back to relationships, right? So, like, I think that there's probably a lot of studies on this. I don't have them at hand that probably I would imagine there's studies that look at, like, the quality of a person's life being measured really by the quality of their relationships and the depth of their relationships with other people. And I think one of the things that, European cultural thought and behavior have wrought on us, and especially under capitalism and Enlightenment ideals, is this atomization of the person, this rugged individualism and then under capitalism into essentially being nothing more than units of production and consumption. And then we don't really have, relationships with other people. For me, I'm married. I've been married for 12 years, been with my wife for 16 years. And we have worked really hard and overcome challenging times to develop a robust marriage that is a reflection of our genuine partnership in life and friendship, right? Like, we are friends, we're partners, and we care for others. I think that, people get pets when they don't have any relationships with other people often, or even if they do. That might sound not what I was meaning to say. But, like, it's funny how even a relationship with an animal can enhance your quality of life. Like, there are care dogs who come into, like, to people who are terminally ill. They'll go into a hospice and bring animals, because just there's something about being in a relationship, but also caring for someone else. In addition to my relationship with my wife, I have held on to friendships that go back very far. And, I have core groups of friends who are friends with each other, where it's not just one-way relationships, that I think is a big part of why I am able to operate in the world with a high level of hope, why I'm able to fend off despair or nihilism, because the truth of my convictions I see played out and borne out in my relationship with my wife and with my male friends and female friends. My three closest guy friends, I saw a video the other day on Instagram talking about how men don't lie, like, men don't have friends. Like, it's weird to be a grown man in your 30s with other male friends. I felt really bad for that person. It's not somebody I was going to argue with, right? I just thought, like, wow, like, that must be a really hard life. Because my three closest male friends, we talk every single day, the three of us. And we have a kind of relationship that's community. C.S. Lewis, we talked about him already. Let me see if I can find this real quick. He has this, like, thing about I think it's in the Four Loves, where he says, if of three friends, A, B, and C, if A should die, then B loses not only A, but A's part in C, while C loses not only A, but A's part in B. Each of my friends, in each of my friends, there's something that only some other friend can fully bring out. By
Mm,
myself, I am not large enough to call the whole man into activity. I want other lights other than my own to show all of his facets. Now that Charles is dead, I shall never again see Ronald's reaction to a specifically Caroline joke. Far from having more of Ronald, having him to myself, now that Charles is away, I have less of Ronald. Hence, true friendship is the least jealous of loves, and two friends delight to be joined by a third, and three by a fourth, if only the newcomer is qualified to be a real friend. So I
mm.
think like it goes back to me saying that like people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Like and Bell Hook's talking about reclaiming love as a political project. That like to be in love, to be in love. She also uses this guy, this a psychologist. His name is escaping me, but M. Scott Peck, who has a
Oh
definition
yeah.
for love, right? Based on saying love is the willingness to extend oneself for one's own or another's spiritual growth. I think when you're engaged in that kind of love and in that kind of relationship, then all of the ideas around nihilism, like nihilism just doesn't make quite much sense to me because I have these relationships. But I think as a society, you see what I'm saying? Because like even if like all of these other like let's say all of these other things were wrong, all of my ideas are wrong. This is not like this is embodied. These relationships are embodied and they're real and I experience them and that you can't deny them. It can't be negotiated away by
Well,
logic.
it also helps. One of the things that I talk a lot about in my work is the poorest self and getting out of the monolithic mind. And I think one of the biggest issues with rugged individualism is not just it's you could also phrase that as like the Charles Taylor, the buffered self, this idea that we live in a world, this illusion in a world in which I can segment myself off from the rest of the world, or I can live in this isolated chamber of thought, when the reality of it is the mind doesn't work that way, the body doesn't
Mhm.
work that way. We're porous.
That's
we
right.
we we adapt to the environment that we're around. It runs through us. The mud and the footprints, like when you step in mud, it's like it belongs to the mud and is part of your foot. Like it's co-created. Like there's a mutual thing there that is created, which is what, Lewis is talking about. It's like, yeah, there's a certain aspect when we're together that it creates a third thing that we can't, it's never going to just be one thing. So it's like, I think what happens with a lot of people is when they do believe in that monolithic mind, those energies that flow through us in the forms of thoughts and the ideologies, belief systems, all this stuff, it begins to almost like dam up. It stays in and it gets heavier and heavier.
Yes.
And that becomes the entire personality. That becomes the entire way of
Yes.
how they view themselves and the world around them. And so it's no
Yep.
longer like what you're participating is. It's what it's like. It's a force inside of you. Is what that's ego inflation. That's what Jung talked. That's what Nietzsche dealt with. It's like no one understands me. No one can. I have no one that I can
Mm.
tell this truth to. That I can. And Nietzsche became more and more frustrated with people because they couldn't keep up with what he was trying to say, because he was like hoarding that energy and not
Mhm.
viewing it through agapic love of like, oh, this is
Mhm.
a process that we're all here in this river. And so like I suspected it was something like that, but to hear you say it just kind of affirms to me, it's like, yeah, the relationality of community is pivotal. But that is something that I would say is really challenging for a lot of people coming out of a worldview in which you're not building that community around propositions or statements of belief, but on true agapic love of being able to accept a person for who they are as, a porous individual that is going to have all sorts of different thoughts. And it's like, that's okay.
That's
Like,
right.
let's let it flow. Let's let this like flow into me. I will hold some of your thoughts. I will take this and you can hold some of mine. And there's like this reciprocal
Mhm.
opening that happens in this mutual
Yeah.
affordance. So I don't know. I mean, I I'm very attracted to the notion of not a new religion, but the new spaces and like creating and conversing about topics like this, because my hope is that as we see the political discourse and the political turmoil and the volume turn up, I think that you will see, and we will see, the urgency and the need for true relationality towards a more expansive space with theosis involved, with theurgy involved, with these practices that offer ways. You mentioned Vedanta, like these ways of noticing, these ways of being mindful, and not just
Hmm.
mindfulness in like the way the capitalistic models talk about it, but like the true sense of the taking off the lens and the framing in which we see, in which we look at the frame and we can see it
Yes.
better. So it's like, I think with my hope with all of this is like just encouraging and inspiring, and myself trying to embody the types of spaces I want to see in the world.
Yeah.
Now, in conversations like that, like this, to me, I know we got to wrap it up, but to me, this has just been like part of that, because there's a deep conversation around all the things that are important to us that have nothing to do with whether or not you're right or I'm right, or whether or not, or not even like the circulating, like let's just like what you were saying earlier, it's like be on the left and affirm certain components of certain things. It's like, actually, there's a lot that we don't know, or I might not see Marx the same way, or I might have stuff to learn about Marx, or you know there's ways of seeing it differently, and that is an actual conversation that I think
Right.
is different than just.
Yeah. Is the conversation happening? Like you said earlier, that's like what's awesome. Like that the conversation is happening. I didn't mean to cut you off there if I did.
Yeah, it's good.
And for me, I I love this idea, when Paul talks about Jesus's resurrected body, he talks about it as a spiritual body. Which is interesting because he doesn't r- resurrect as a spirit. He resurrects as an incorporated as a corporal body, but his body is different. It's a spiritual body. He eats, but he also walks through walls, right? You can touch him, but he can also teleport. To me, when I talk about Vedanta Christianity, this collapse of the nature versus supernature dichotomy,
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
my Marxist material analysis is that material is spiritual. And our commitment to each other must be, if it is spiritual, if it is a spiritual commitment, it is borne out in our material reality. And that's why like liberation of the oppressed is something to me that's so important. But that conversation, in order for that to happen, it has to happen in community, which is so hard. If I, Trey, had been exposed to all the same arguments I've been exposed to throughout my life, but I was exposed to them at a secular university. I went to Oral Roberts University. It's one of the most conservative, right wing, evangelical, charismatic Christian universities in the country. Okay. A lot of people know about Liberty. It's like Liberty.
I went there. I was there for a year.
Okay, great. So, like Liberty's, a lot of, there's a lot of relationship between the two. So if I had gone to like a state university, I would have encountered all the same arguments from a polemical advantage, where I would have been trying to debunk them and refute them. But because I went to ORU with people who were in my community, and I was in community with those people, and I saw them as humans and not as enemies, when I was exposed to ideas that challenged my assumptions or that caused me to stretch myself, I was more open to those ideas because I didn't view them as attack. And so we have to present ideas. I think if we present them in a polemical way, you already lost. If you present them in a dialectical way, in a way that you're having a conversation where you view the other person as human, then you're working with something. If we won't maintain relationships with people who are dramatically different than us, then that will never evolve as a species and as a civilization. Because like people, I have people that comment on to me like when I talk about how I'm friends with a megachurch pastor, or like one of my best friends, Dexter, is like a Kojic, that's Church of God in Christ. Is like a very particular brand of Pentecostal. He's like a minister in that world. And he like goes around and he's like, he preaches the way you would expect like a black Pentecostal preacher to preach, right? If you're like, you're friends with these kinds of people, like why? Especially if you on the left have that opinion quite often. And I'm like, brother, because there's no other way to live. Like, what am I going to do? Only be friends with people that agree with me, and then we can get around and make each other feel good and get more and more outraged about the world? Like, I may never change his mind, but My goal is to, like I said earlier, live out and embody the ideal world that I want to be like it is now. Just like this idea of the gospel in the New Testament from Paul and Jesus wasn't a word they developed or that they invented. It was a Greek term that was specifically used when one king was deposed or died and a new king came in. The gospel with the evangelion was the good news. What good news? The good news that there's a new king in town. And they would send out heralds into the world to proclaim the gospel that there's a new Caesar. Well, when they're saying that, they're saying decisively, hey, the kingdom of love, the kingdom of heaven has defeated the powers of sin and death, but you don't know it yet. You're still living in a world that's being governed by powers and principalities, by local rulers that they're not operating under the kingdom, under the authority of the new king. They're operating under the authority of the old systems. And so the church was called to be the community of people who lived and acted in the world today as heralds, as if they were living under the ruling authority of the new king. And so to me, it's like, hey, what is the future we're being drawn towards? We have to live that out now. And to me, that looks like radical empathy, love, and care and relationship. And I think if we abandon that, then we don't really have much left.
I mean, 100%. And it was like, and I think that's what is to me, the biggest takeaway with the message of, what Paul was saying. It's like, there is a dehumanizing regime of the Roman. It's like, there were a lot of people that were dehumanized, and this agapic love was a humanizing force. Agape humanizes, it creates humans. That's what we do with children. When we love and we nurture children, we are why are we doing that? Like, we don't choose to love. It's like the thing that's like, it's moving through us. And what is it actually doing? It's creating this individual into a human. It's giving them components of humanity, and that like that ability, that source, that power has always been the core fundamental strength. It's always been the core like essence of what it always is. And the access that we have to it, again, going back to like, once something gets literalized or flattened into this propositional belief, well, now it's sectarian, or it's dogmatic, or it's trying to preserve something that we don't really know where we're getting it from. And I think that, I like going to what you're saying, like, when we truly understand the agapic nature of it, we actually understand this, like, that is a humanizing force for all people in our lives. And also, like, I always just look at it as like, anybody that disagrees, or anybody that is stuck in a position of like, oh, this is just wrong or whatever. Most of the time, it's like, it's not really, to me, it's not the best way of looking at it. It's like, oh, here's a person that is choosing to be against me, or choosing to view a thing a certain way. It's like, it's much more helpful to realize that here's a person that has a frame. Who knows where they got it from? Who knows like what conditionings in life led them to have this? But if anything, it's just like an unreflected algorithmic frame that, why would I get upset because of that? I don't get upset Instagram algorithms for being Instagram. Like, I just realized like that's what they are, and that's what's going on. So getting trapped in that, I think that is that. And I think, to me, I was having a conversation with my buddy about this yesterday. We were talking about, just being around different people, and like being in these conversations that this feel cyclical or repetitive. It's like people, it's like are constantly, harping on the same thing. And, you can get frustrated with that or bored by it. And like, man, whatever. But it's like, lately, it's like been looking at, it's like, there is a reflective, curious, sacred self within all of us that might not have had agapic love, or might not have been nurtured, or just hasn't come out. But we don't know when that will be. We think about our own lives. Like, we don't know when those moments of insight happen, or where like those like radically shifting paradigms will take place. And so it's much easier to just, view them as like, oh, this is who they are, instead of saying, I don't know what I'm talking about right now might not have much salience to you in this moment. But I've seen this happen over and over, where, time goes by, or something happens in someone's life, or they have, some kind of life altering event, and they'll come back and they're like, actually, this makes a lot of sense now. Or, they start to see, and to me, it all goes back to the symbolic, imaginal, like, quality of life, because once that comes alive for someone, and they're able to kind of step back and reflect on it, it really does, drastically alter and shift the capacity to have, like just I mean, it changes everything. And so I think like that's why and I'm still learning that. Like that's really the biggest thing where I'm really trying to hold that mindset and like mindfully practice that of not getting caught up in the illusions, or how do I say it? Not getting distracted by the propositions of somebody.
Yes. Yeah, you lose the real meaning. The most absurd example of this is my algorithm on TikTok is full of debates, live TikTok live debates between people debating the doctrine of the Trinity. Is God Trinity? Is God not? And it's always framed like God is Trinity. If you're wrong, you're an idiot. Prove me wrong. And they invite people up. They argue or to argue what is or isn't a heretical analogy for the Trinity. And I'm like, guys, like the Trinity is the analogy for the kenosis, the self pouring out of love from God to God that we are supposed to emulate and be like, right? Like and now you've turned the whole meaning of the thing into the antithesis of what it is because you missed the symbolic meaning. Just imagine if Christians spent hours debating the historical veracity of the parable of the sower. Well, no, there is no, there would have somebody in that region wouldn't have been sowing those kinds of seeds.
Yeah.
Next kind of season, the sower is real, or you're an idiot. Prove me wrong. Where it's like, well, what is the meaning of the parable of the sower? We get lost.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, I love it. This has been really good. I feel like I could probably talk to you for a really long time. So I think maybe that'd be a good place to wrap it up. And then we'll have to do this again, man. I hope to have more conversations with you and kind of develop a continuing friendship here because I feel like we're both kind of on a similar trajectory and yeah, doing similar things in life. And so I think it's like I said, I've been encouraged to by your journey, just the stuff that you're involved in, stuff that you're posting, and the way that you're kind of showing up in the world. So I'm excited for that and excited to see how this friendship develops.
I appreciate it, man. Likewise, this has been really fun. I definitely want it to continue as well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.